So what could possibly be interesting about this subject? It's a subject that I think most people have traditionally found really, really dull. Lost insulation, turn your thermostat down, that's all we tend to hear. But personally, I find it a very interesting subject. And my goal is to turn what I think is a room full of people who are clearly curious into being a little bit geeky in at least one bit of what I'm going to talk about today, which is all about less well-known insights and some new insights as well, and some tricks and tips on how to keep warm and save energy. But it's important to say that this agenda and anything to do with decarbonisation at the moment is under attack from misinformation campaigns, deliberate misinformation campaigns, which unfortunately don't really help. So I just want to warn you about that. But if you're back in December, I do a talk specifically about misinformation anyway. But it does colour the whole subject, unfortunately, through very sophisticated means that I'll talk about in December. So a little bit about me. My background is engineering and energy in the last decade or so, but I've also done a lot in this sort of area. So I've got a 1950s house. This is my house. 14 years ago, we did a bit of an extension on it, and we put a heat pump in, solar electricity panels, solar hot water, heat recovery ventilation system, and made it quite as airtight as we reasonably could. And that's been a great success. So I've done one eco home retrofit project already. And then 3 or 4 years later, my in-laws moved into the area, and they allowed me to do the same thing to their bungalow, more or less, and they're still talking to me. So I did that before they moved into it. So they got a heat pump and solar panels and all that sort of stuff as well. So I've got a lot of sort of personal experience like that. I've also got a thermal imaging camera, which I bought 12, 13 years ago, intending to go into business, but never did. So I've got a camera that I've done loads and loads of surveys for free in the local area around Northwich, which is a fantastic tool, but it's only part of the thing about heating in homes, and it's really useful to help understand what's going on with energy in a home. And then lastly, in the last 12 years or so, I've worked in the energy sector before I sort of semi-retired. So I'm in public sector, developing new technologies and so on in this area, working for government ultimately. So I understand the energy side of this from the grid and the infrastructure side as well. And with all the knowledge I've picked up, particularly doing local energy surveys, I started this website up a year ago, which is really to help educate people about energy in the home. It's not just draft-proof lists of things to do. Actually, it's got very practical information on how to draft-proof the loft hatch, how to set your boiler up right, how to use thermostatic radiator valves, and just click-free, no advertising, nothing on it. I just do it purely. I want to try and help people understand this agenda because it is quite complicated. And the thing about energy and energy in the home is it isn't rocket science, but it's not something any of us get taught at any point in our lives. You know, unless you've got into physics and you've done a bit of physics that's really aligned with it, anything that you know about how to manage your home, you know, how to use thermostats, how to do is just random knowledge you've acquired over the years from friends, family, whatever you might have read. But so it isn't actually rocket science. And some of what you'll hear today, you'll go, oh, is that it? Is that all there is to it? And unfortunately, in some cases, that is. It's just not knowledge that people have really focused on in the past. But of course, with the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis, there's been more and more focus on trying to help people understand this agenda. So a little bit of history. Heating in homes, as in central heating in homes, is something we've become very used to over the last 50 or 60 years. I feel really lucky in that, apart from one miserable winter when I was a student, when I had frost on the inside of the windows and it was impossible to keep warm, I've lived in centrally heated homes pretty much all my adult life. So I feel very lucky. So we've had the golden years really of centrally heated homes with 90-odd% of homes now have got central heating of some sort. Most of that being gas, of course, with oil and electric storage and an LPG and so on, making up the balance as well. But we have got used to having the whole home warm, either some or all of the time. And you'll hear expressions like the UK has got the leakiest buildings in Europe in terms of energy. And what does that mean? So I'm going to try and explain that in this graph here, this chart. So if you take the average British home, and if the temperature indoors is 20 degrees and it's 0 or freezing outside, after 5 hours after the heating has gone off, the average UK home will have fallen by about 3 degrees. So if it started off at 20, which is a nice typical temperature that most people would have their home at, after 5 hours it would have gone down to 17, which is quite cool, obviously. So that's how quickly the average home in the UK will have cooled by after 5 hours after the heating's gone off. If you look at our near neighbour countries across yonder water, you'll see some big variations. Belgium, very similar to us. Netherlands, slightly better. Their housing types are very different to here. That's roughly where they are. They're similar. So in the same conditions, this is how much the temperature would have dropped in these individual countries. So we are the worst, but there are some that are not much better than us. But if you look at the Scandinavian countries in particular, the gold standard, of course, being Norway there, a Norwegian home will only have dropped by 0.9 of a degree after 5 hours, which to be honest is astonishing, really. But of course, it's just down to having an attention to detail and thinking about insulation, and they have lots of insulation. And you can't buy double glazing in Norway now, I believe. And they've had to do it because they've had more extreme winters. You know, we have had the benefit to a certain extent of the Gulf Stream, where we've had relatively moderate climate. Really, it's never been terribly cold. It's never been terribly hot. We've been able to get away with pretty slack building standards for many years. And of course, in the last 50 or 60 years, we've had pretty cheap energy from North Sea gas, in particular, that's made the difference. So we've never had to react to the needs of heating homes, particularly. Of course, we now need to, from the point of view of heating costs and, of course, carbon as well. So overall, we are the worst out of that group. But of course, there are lots of other countries in Eastern Europe in particular which will be worse than us, I'm sure. So that's one way of comparing this. But despite the fact we are the worst, over the same sort of time period, these charts here show the average internal temperature in UK homes in winter. So in the 1970s, homes were typically sort of 12, 13, 14 degrees on average, which by my standards as a Nesh person is bloody cold. But then when heating started to take off in the 80s, you can see there that the average and insulation, of course, the average temperature has risen now to somewhere in the high teens in general. And interesting, this bottom line here out of these top three, this dark green one, is for homes that don't have central heating in them. And there are still some. I've got a friend in Liverpool who's a 3-bed semi with solid walls, and she's got no central heating, but that's fine. And she likes it like that at 13 degrees. I don't visit her in winter. But even in that sort of home, the average temperatures have improved, mainly because of glazing, UPVC glazing, and at least some insulation. It may not be the full amount in the loft, etc. But so even homes that haven't got central heating have improved over the years to a degree, despite the fact that we're the worst in Europe, out of our near neighbours anyway. But with heat and comfort, it's a very weird subject in that it's not simply a case of one temperature, all circumstances, everybody wants the same thing. We all feel comfort a little bit differently. So here's a little bit of the sort of science behind it. And I met an academic from UCL in London who studied this area. It was his specialty area, and I learned a lot from him. And one thing I learned was that most people are pretty comfortable in a room that's about 20 degrees centigrade. I say most people deliberately. And for that reason, this sort of happy band in the middle is why airports typically are sort of 20, 21 degrees, that sort of temperature, because most people are comfortable at that temperature. But there are people, particularly in older age groups, who are only comfortable in the mid to high 20s. So I go to visit my in-laws who are 91, now one of them is, and I go into their bungalow and I have to wear a t-shirt at the very bottom because after an hour, I stripped everything off because the lounge is like a bloody oven. And it is. It really is, but that's their comfort zone. And my father-in-law's there in his woolly cardigan, and the lounge is 25 degrees, and I don't understand it. But it is where he is physically comfortable for his age, and this does vary with your metabolic activity and your weight, and I mentioned age and other factors too. But we are all variable. We are all variable. We are all different. So sometimes you'll hear, this thing about arguments about the thermostat. Sometimes it's comfort, sometimes it's somebody in the house being meaner than somebody else. But there is a genuine thermal comfort difference for different people. Then at the opposite end of the scale, and there were two bits of surprise in what I learned from this academic. David Shipton's his name, if you're interested in him, is that there are some people who are only comfortable down here. And there's a guy that works at Ofgem, who's Australian in London. He works in London, and he moved to the UK for the weather. No, those were his words. I'm not making any of this up. Those were his words. And he walks around London permanently in short sleeves and shorts. His flat, he says, he doesn't bother heating it. He leaves the windows open for fresh air. And that is his comfort zone. So for him, anything sort of 20 degrees and above is abysmally hot. So for him, like the heat wave we had last summer would have been absolutely horrible, really, really horrible. It's only he recognises himself like that. Now, they're fairly rare, people like that. But you'll see some people out in winter, won't you, in flip-flops or sandals, and you think, how on earth is that person possibly comfortable? Well, they are, because they're in that sort of category and they're quite rare. Or they're drunk. And then you look at their walk style and what they're holding. And then there's a really interesting, rarer animal, somebody who is comfortable at any temperature. And I've only come across two people like that. I've been doing this talk for 3 and a bit years. I've come across two people that recognize themselves like that. And they are really, really rare. Sorry, I should go back to that one there. This previous case here, there was a woman in a talk I did in a cold village hall a few months ago, sorry, last winter. And the hall was at about 16 degrees. Everyone was there wrapped up, and she said she was hot. And everybody went, what? It's freezing cold in here. Anyway, she was in this left-hand category. So yes, so there are people who, when they're going on holiday, it doesn't matter where they go, they pack the same amount of clothing because they're comfortable in what I'm wearing in either cold conditions or in hot conditions. So it's a really wonderful world from their point of view. And from a comfort point of view, it must be heaven, but they are quite rare. There's probably only 1% of people out there or something like that that are like that. And then how we feel comfort will vary depending on the bit of the body that's at a different temperature. So I used to be an engineer at Rolls-Royce in Crewe, working on all sorts of things, including heating and ventilation. And you probably aren't aware of this, but all cars by design these days are configured in a way so that you will tend to get warmer air to your feet than you get to your face. Most people like to drive a car with warmish feet or warm feet. I like to have toasty feet and fresh air on your face. And that's because humans prefer comfort in that way. They prefer their face to be several degrees cooler than the feet. And the reason I'm mentioning all that is because in a home, we heat typically with radiators on the wall like this, which is sending a warm column of air up the wall, over the ceiling, and down the other side, and eventually your feet will get warm. So your feet are the last thing to get warm. So you can have a difference of temperature, several degrees between the foot level and the ceiling temperature. So you might have a lovely warm ceiling. That's great. That's going to lose all that heat into the loft if it's upstairs. But your feet, you won't feel comfortable till your feet are warm. Sometimes when I'm doing talks like this, I might be near a fire exit or near the door and I can feel a cold draft. And it might be a really warm room, but I've got a cold draft on my feet. And my feet are pretty sensitive, probably compared to most people. But if your feet aren't warm for most people, the rest of you won't be warm. So that's not very efficient compared to, pardon me. Right, the delay of the technology here. So compared to this situation, which is designed for you for comfort, home is actually a pretty inefficient environment. It doesn't suit us. Your feet are the canary in the coal mine, and you will crank the thermostat up or leave the radiators on until your feet feel warm, by which time the rest of you might be too hot. So it's not very good. But that's how we do it most of the time. But in contrast, and the reason for labelling all of this is if you've got a room with underfloor heating in it, the bit that gets the heat first is your feet. So your feet are the most important thing to have the warmth, and that's why when you walk into an underfloor heated room, most people will go, "Ooh, has this got underfloor heating in here?" And that's the reason, because your feet are suddenly getting a fantastic experience. And it also means that by the time the air has moved up and lost some of its energy, your face will actually be a lower temperature to your feet. So it's much more like the car. So when you hear expressions like underfloor heating is more efficient than radiators, the reason is it's getting the heat to the human in the right way for how we are physically wired. And depending on how you're heating your system and different comparisons, it's somewhere in the region of 15 to 14% more efficient to heat a room that way, because you're only heating the bits of you that need to be heated to the degree to which they need to be heated. So I've got a few mottos in this presentation to sort of to let you take away. One is when you're thinking about your own situation when you go back home, to think about trying to keep heat where you want it. So a slightly grander version of the previous slide in terms of this situation here. This is a typical situation with a radiator, central heating radiator on the wall. You can see the nice even flow up the wall there, up to the ceiling, and then meandering back down, as I described earlier on. What we have a habit of doing traditionally, though, for various reasons that I won't go into now, is we have a habit of putting them under windows. And even if you've got the latest generation double glazing, all of this disruption here around the windowsill, this basic airflow distribution, is completely different to the one on the left. It's much more disrupted in terms of airflow, and what it's actually doing is doing a great job of sending heat out the window. It's a practical reality, but the surface of that glass, if that radiator is nice and hot, will be nice and warm. So it doesn't make sense from the point of view of getting heat into the room, generally, to put a radiator under the window. What we have a habit of doing in the UK, particularly in hotels, guest houses, people do it in their home. My in-laws have got it in one room, and I hate them for it, is we have a habit of putting full-length curtains in front of it like that. And that's really saying to that heat, go out the window, please, because that's what it's going to do. On a cold winter's day, in a situation like that, if you were to go outside, you'd feel the outside of the glass and it would be warm, even with double glazing. So full-length curtains over radiators are bonkers. Sorry, hand up at the back. Does that mean you've got full-length curtains and you want to fess up? Two reasons. One, so the question was, why do we put radiators on the windows anyway? Two reasons are, one is because people don't like them against the wall there where they might want to put furniture, side wall. So you're less likely to put furniture under a window. And the other reason is because in the days of single glazing, when heating was first introduced, it helped to sort of balance the room out and make the room temperature overall a bit more even, because you had the heat near where the cold was coming in. And of course, we're into most houses are now UPVC is in 80% of homes. So now there's less need for it from that point of view. But it was driven by a comfort need in the days when energy was cheap. Yes, wrong. Yeah. But you can see how this image on the left, it's lovely and efficient. That heat's going to warm the room up at its fastest possible rate. Another question, hello. Yeah. So yeah. Yes. So yeah, sure. But you're right. There are a couple of products. One of them's called RadFan. It's a tiny little thing that sits on top of a radiator. The question was, do those things work? They don't push out very much air. I do have one, I've got a steel narrowboat, a canal boat, and I use it in there because the room is small enough for it to make a difference. And on the canal boat, you really want to get the heat into the room as quickly as you can in winter. So they do make a little bit of a difference, but it's really small. Yes. Yeah. 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 No, and also you've got these two little fans whirring away the whole time. They're quite noisy. So I wouldn't bother. And the room will warm up slightly quicker, but it won't be very much. Question of the question. Yeah. If you want the room above heating at that time, yeah. Yeah. I need to move on. So on the right-hand side, so just to reflect on this right-hand diagram a minute, if you haven't got full-length curtains, you might still have longish curtains like this. So this is our guest bedroom at home, and I have finally convinced my wife to tuck the curtains in behind the radiator. It took a while, but the left-hand side here shows very much the same sort of situation as the previous slide, and the heat from the radiator is just going to go into the window. And yes, some will get into the room, but you're going to be losing an awful lot of heat. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's actually helping the heat go into the room, which is where you want it because that's where you are. So it doesn't look as pretty, doesn't look as tidy. In her view, in my engineering view, it's perfection. So where are we next? And then there are other sort of old-fashioned techniques which do make a definite difference. Keeping curtains drawn, unless the sun's coming in, of course, keep your curtains drawn. Even during the daytime, we keep our curtains drawn most of the time, and the neighbours think we're a bit strange, I think. But it does make a difference. And keeping doors shut internally, particularly shutting off rooms that you don't use very much, or even rooms that you're in and out of a lot during the day. If you keep the door shut, if you want to keep one room at 24 degrees and you want to keep another room at 20 degrees, the best thing for efficiency is to keep the two rooms apart and keep the doors shut. And testing at Strathclyde University has proven that these things do have significant benefit, even these simple little things around the home. And I'll show you figures, a little bit of a number on it later on. And the other reason for keeping doors shut is if you're in a two-story home, if you've got a lounge, and lounges tend to be a little bit warmer than other rooms, normally maybe 22, 23, some people have the lounge up. In this typical situation here, if you leave that lounge door open, even though you won't feel it, the air in the room and the lounge will be warmer at the top. It will start to meander invisibly, of course, and undetectably upstairs. It will gradually cool, lose its heat, and it will come down, and you get this gradual, slow cycle of warm air from the lounge disappearing away from your lounge and cold air coming back down as a draft. And if you try this for yourself, if you close your door, if you've got a situation like this, just to within a couple of inches, and you put your hand at the bottom or at the top, you will actually feel that warm airflow at the top, and you'll feel the cold airflow at the bottom. It will accentuate the airflow, so you can actually feel that. So I went to visit a house last winter, and the guy in the house said, "Look, I always feel cold when I sit on the chair that's just inside the doorway here." And he leaves the door open all the time. I said, "Well, shut the bloody door, and you'll feel warm." And he did, and he's happy now. So yeah, even though you can't feel it, warm air will rise, and that's what will happen. You will, and your radiator in here will have to work harder, and you'll end up with cold feet. And of course, you don't want cold feet. Well, most people don't want cold feet. So all this stuff, keeping doors shut, and the correct use of thermostatic radiator valves in combination will save somewhere between 10 and 30% of your energy bill today. Yeah. And I would say out of all the homes I visited last winter, I did 30 odd homes, energy surveys, so just freebie surveys I do. I reckon everyone could save 20% on their energy bill just by doing things a little bit different. So the next motto is control it. If you don't control it, how can you minimize it? And it's not a case of being cold. It's just a case of avoiding overheating rooms unnecessarily. You go 1 degree more warmer than you need to in any room, and you're wasting money. So the unsung hero in all of energy efficiency and every home are these things. And they are fantastic devices. I used to think they were pretty dreary little mechanical things until I actually started to do testing on them, be real sad testing in the home. If you use these correctly, you will save around 18% on your energy bill. But most people don't understand how they work. And there was a survey that showed that. 68%, I think it was, or 64% of people didn't know how these things worked. And I very, very rarely find people who do. And part of the reason for that is nobody tells you how they work. Plumbers don't tell you how they work. And the instructions on them are crap, really. But the numbers on them, they've all got a scale of 1 to 5. Some have got 1 to 6, some have got 1 to 7. And the number on that scale represents temperature. Most of them are 1 to 5. And the default that most people should start with, and they don't, is to put it at number 3. If you put one of these things at number 3, the room temperature will go no higher than 20 degrees, give or take. There'll be little errors and depends how big the room is and whether the radiator is adequate size. But by and large, a room will be limited to 20 degrees. If you leave that at number 3, it will not go any warmer. And number 4 is a big step upwards, 24 degrees. And number 5 is 28, which of course no one would want their house at 28. But because these things aren't understood, people go into a room. If it isn't warm enough, they'll crank it up to number 5. They'll just crank it fully open. The radiator will just carry on pumping out as much heat as it possibly can because it thinks it's being asked to go up to 28 degrees. It may not get there, but it'll certainly go warmer than you want. And then, of course, people will come back into the room an hour too late, so the room's too warm. And what they do then, they turn it down to 0. So I didn't do it here tonight. And nearly always, whenever I go into any building, including a pub, we'll always look at the settings that these things are on. And nearly always number 5, or occasionally there's 0. What are those settings at? So the temperature room yo-yos from being overheating to cold, basically, and not in control at all. So the way to use these is to start off with them at number 3. If the room isn't quite warm enough, probably this wasn't rocket science, if the room isn't quite warm enough, just tweak it a tiny bit, because you probably only want it to be a degree warmer or a 2 degree warmer. So if it's at number 3, put it up to halfway between 3 and 4, which is going to be about 22 degrees. If you turn it up full, the radiator won't respond any more quickly. It will just overheat. So just nudge it up fractionally, wait for half an hour, and the room will respond. I have measured it. These things do respond even to tiny adjustments like that. Or if it's too warm in a room, don't turn it off. Just nudge it down a little bit. Because even a small amount on this will lower the temperature in the room by a degree or a couple of degrees. So never go full on, never go full off unless you're leaving the house and you want to completely shut the heating off and then turn it down to number 1. So small amounts of adjustment on these are the way to do it. And say every degree that you overheat a room, you are just wasting money completely unnecessarily and just inciting people to take layers off. They don't need to take layers off or even open windows, so it's crazy. I'm going to break a few myths now as well. So one of the questions that comes up repeatedly online, it's a persistent myth, is it more economical to have your heating on 24/7 rather than just have it on when you need it? And the answer is it's a myth to do that. There are some circumstances where you might save a little bit of money if you run it 24/7, but you've really got to have the latest boiler set up in the right way, thermostat set up in the right way. You've got to have a lifestyle where you would have been in a lot anyway, where you would have had your heating on a lot anyway. So it can work out cheaper to do it, but generally it's best to only have your heating on when you actually need it on. Particularly if you're in a household where you're only needing it on really in the morning or in the evening. So most of the time, 24-hour strategy of leaving it on all the time. Certainly with a fossil fuel system will be more expensive. Another myth that I love busting this one because the data from it is hilarious. So there are 12 million homes where the owners leave the heating on more than they would for themselves for the sake of the pets. People going out to work, out shopping, and I'll leave it on because of Tiddles or Fido. Because pictures like this give you the impression that they really like it and they really need it like that. And that is a hard statistic, pretty hard statistic. 40% of homeowners, roughly, admit to doing that. Is anybody here who's a pet owner who admits to it? No, nobody ever does. Do you? Right. Right. So all animal health experts and animal welfare experts say you don't need to do it. Exactly. Because their blood temperature is higher than ours. They've got a fur coat clearly. And actually, it does encourage lice and ticks as well. So a constantly overwarm environment for them is actually harmful. It can be harmful. But basically, there is absolutely no need to do it. If you do feel you want to get an emotional reward and help them, get them one of these things. And if they don't use them, they don't need it. But basically, most pets don't need it. If you've got a chinchilla or a rabbit, you can do what you like because they're very hardy. Chinchilla will go down to about 5 degrees, amazing. If you've got a hamster or a gerbil, they are sensitive to temperature, a bit like a human. So they're quite, you've got to look after them. But cats and dogs, you absolutely don't. And chinchillas and rabbits, you don't either. And then ask yourself, this sort of came to light going around some of the homes I've visited. I say to people, why have you got a hallway that's so warm? Why do you heat your hallway? Why do you heat your utility room? Why do you heat your downstairs living? They're not going to freeze. You're not in them for very long. But if you want to save money, why are you running all these radiators? I visited one home last winter, and the hall was at 24 degrees. Quite a big hall too. And I said, why is your radiator red hot and your hallway so warm? And they said, well, it's always been like that. Oh yeah, we don't need that warm, do we? Really? So stand back from the whole environment and say, well, why are we heating these things when actually they're not actually areas we spend very much time in? And then if you've got an airing cupboard, a traditional airing cupboard, we've got this lovely romantic attachment to aired towels in an airing cupboard, which makes no sense at all because we don't air our clothes or our laundry in an airing cupboard. So why should we do it with towels? But the reason I'm saying all this is if you've got a warm airing cupboard, it means your tank could be lagged better. The pipework to it could be lagged better because if you've got any heat leaking out into your cupboard there's only one place that's going to go, and that's going to go up into the top of the cupboard and out into the attic space. Some of it will get out into the rest of the house, but it's the warmest part of the house usually. But it's not where you are, so why are you heating it? So if you've got a warm airing cupboard. If you've got anything warm in it at all, lag it to death. Because the cooler an airing cupboard is, the better. It'll still always be warmer than the rest of the house. And there's absolutely no need to have a warm airing cupboard. You are just wasting money if you have a hot airing cupboard. Next motto is you paid for it, so keep it. I can't remember what's next, actually. What's next? Yes. So cavity wall insulation is something that's been around many decades. If you put your hand on a masonry wall, a brick or a plaster wall in particular, like this one or that one there, it will feel cold. The reason it's feeling cold is it's taking heat away from your hand. Masonry and brick, traditional building materials, are a very, very good conductor of heat. Really good. They're like a sponge. You have to think of a wall as a sponge for heat. So cavity wall insulation is a way of stopping that sponge getting it to the outside world. So I had an experience many years ago. I did press a button. Try again. Here we go. I've got a cavity wall insulated house, but I've got one wall that wasn't cavity wall insulated. It's an internal wall. Bizarrely, the builder made an error or something, and I have an internal wall that's like this. So I've got an internal wall with no cavity, and I've got a radiator against it in one of the bedrooms. That's warming the brickwork up on that wall behind it very nicely. And I was up in the loft one day, 12 or 13 years ago, and I put my hand above it whilst the radiator was on, and I could feel warm air coming out from the cavity. So that radiator was transmitting quite a lot of heat into the brickwork on the internal face of the wall from the bedroom. It was warming the air up in that cavity, and it was chimneying out the top into the loft. I didn't measure the temperature of the air at the time in that was coming out because it was before I really got into this sort of geeky world. But it was really warm air. I mean, the loft temperature was probably 8 or 10 degrees or something. It was certainly going to be air in the 20s 20 something degrees or maybe even 30-degree warm. But it was a real wow moment to me in terms of how good cavity wall insulation is. And this is my next door neighbour's house last winter. So their house used to finish in the middle. This used to be where the gable wall was, but the previous owners had extended the house. So they have an internal wall that's got no cavity in it, as a sort of legacy of the sort of history to the house, really. And you can see as the snow is starting to melt preferentially above the cavity wall, which goes down to their kitchen in the main. So that's another sort of clear visual indication as to how effective cavity wall is at keeping heat in. Hello, question? Yes. Yeah. 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 Yeah, do it. I always do it. I even do it on internal normal walls because it stops. Why heat the wall up first? You want the air in the room to be heated first when you've got a radiator on the wall. So I've always done it. You can make your own with a bit of tin foil and a bit of cardboard, do a tidy job, or you can buy it. It's like silvery bubble pack. It's really cheap. So there's not a huge amount of benefit, but there is a little bit. Yeah, particularly on outside walls, and particularly on solid walls, I would always put the silver foil stuff behind. Yeah. And then there is another benefit of doing this as well, cavity wall insulation, sorry. If you've got a south-facing wall on a hot summer's day, it can certainly reach 45-degree brick temperature on the outside. And that will warm the cavity up if you've got no cavity wall insulation, and give you basically a risk of the house being warmer than it needs to be. So, red hot outer bricks will absorb a lot of heat, and hold that heat, and ultimately it will contribute to the internals of the house being warmer than they need to. Not by a massive amount, but cavity wall insulation, if you do use it, if you do put it in, is likely to help a little bit with keeping a house cooler in summer as well. Now we're on to the really interesting subject of loft insulation. You're all still awake. This is remarkable. So there's another reason for doing loft insulation. We think of loft insulation as being something we do for winter and trying to keep heat in. But a loft in a home, a conventional loft like this one here in summer, south-facing loft can easily get over 40 degrees. I have been up and measured my loft temperature at 40 something. That's a photo coming up. So a very hot, and you shower. Most people have a hot shower at about 40 degrees, 42 degrees. So a loft at that temperature is not a very pleasant place. And if you haven't got any loft insulation or you haven't got enough, that heat will get ultimately it will have an effect on heating the rooms below. So summer, keeping a house cool, particularly if you're going to have warmer and warmer summers, is something that is really very useful about loft insulation. It's one of the best things you can do to help with summer overheating. And to illustrate that fact, I took a photograph of my landing ceiling on a hot sunny day. It's not a very interesting photograph, I admit. So I was lying on my back on the landing, taking a photograph of the ceiling. And the reason I did it was above this ceiling, I cleared a hole in my loft insulation. So I've got about a foot of loft insulation everywhere, except above this ceiling area here, where I've got a hole that's sort of a foot diameter. So there's just a bare ceiling plasterboard underneath. So there's no loft insulation in that very localized area. So then on a July sunny day with a nice hot loft, I took a photograph with my infrared camera. And I expected there to be a warm area of ceiling, but I didn't know how much warmer it would be. So it was a warm sunny day. It was late July last year. The ceiling that is everywhere around that, most of the ceiling in the house is sort of 27 degrees, as you can see on this sort of blue color code chart at the bottom. So the bulk of the area of the upstairs of the house is at 27 degrees. Where I got the hole in the loft insulation, it was 5 degrees higher. So if I got no loft insulation at all, the whole of the ceiling of the house indoors would have been 32 degrees. So if you think that bedrooms need to be really about 18 degrees for good sleep quality, summer heat and summer overheating and summer sleep quality is significantly affected by loft insulation. So if you've got none, And I do know someone that's got none in an old cottage because they can't get to the loft, and their cottage is horrible in summer. But you can make it a lot better with the right amount of loft insulation. So it's not just a winter thing. I would argue in years ahead, it's going to be even more important to do it for summer cooling as well. And then cold floors. I am a cold foot person. Unfortunately, I do get cold feet very easily. Not everybody does, but we've got around about 20% of homes in the UK have got suspended downstairs floors from various eras over the last 100 years or so in terms of building, where there's a space below the downstairs floors. It might only be 18 inches. It might be a full cellar or somewhere in between, or a crawling space. And this space underneath these wooden floors is vented to the outside world through vent bricks around the outside of the property. And it has to be like that to stop the timbers rotting in the floor. So what you've got is very cold air underneath your floor. It's vented to the outside world. So in winter, it will be, you know, a little bit above, a little bit warmer than outside, but not much. And then you have a floorboard and then a piece of carpet and then your feet. So there are two problems with this. One is it's a very thin amount of stuff between you and the floor, sorry, between you and the cold space underneath. And also you get drafts around the edge. So I've lived in a house like this. I hated every minute of it. But I did take action, and there are some simple things you can do, and there's a whole guide to what you can do on my site. You can draft proof around the edges. It's not an exciting thing to do, a fashionable thing to do, not something you tell your mates you've done back down the pub, but it does make a big difference actually. And you can also get insulated underlay. This is a picture here of the old-fashioned wool underlay that used to be the only underlay you could get. And you can still get it, and it's equivalent to a 3.5 tog quilt. So it's nearly as warm as a summer weight continental quilt, and it's actually cheaper than the modern stuff. So this stuff is fantastic at giving you a woolly blanket basically between your feet and the floorboards below. And so I've done that, and that made a huge difference too. And I actually do this everywhere now because it's a little bit warm underneath your feet. So those are some of the simple things you can do. There are more invasive things you can do. You can insulate with rock wool underneath, this is doing it the very hard way, of course, because somebody hasn't got the ability to do it from underneath. But you can, if you can do it from underneath, you can do it and make a difference. The best solution of all is spray foam from underneath using open cell spray foam. And there are companies that will go underneath if you've got crawling space and spray the underside with stuff that will actually transform the experience downstairs. Question from the back.
Yeah, so
yeah.
counter
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So if you can't, so there's two questions there. One was about airflow, and you might end up with problems. Yes, and then the other one was about practicality to doing it from underneath if you can't get access to it. So with the airflow one, I will touch on this later. Anything you do to improve the insulation or the air tightness of the home will affect the indoor air quality and the ventilation. So you can't not ventilate a home, otherwise you end up with damp and humidity and indoor air quality issues. And you have to be careful whenever you do anything to make sure you there's still adequate ventilation in the rest of the home. So there's no fixed ways of how you do that. There's a whole menu of different things to do to improve ventilation in a way that doesn't mean losing lots of heat. If you can't physically get access to underneath, let's say you've only got a foot underneath your floorboards and you don't want to rip all your floorboards up, there's a small British company and a British invention, which is a small robot, which they send in through an air brick, and it sprays the underside of the floor from underneath without a human having to go down there. If you've got about 600 or 700 mil, there are companies that will go underneath and send a man down and spray from the underside for about £35 a square metre, which is really good value, I think, compared to, because it does solve a huge comfort issue. It's more about comfort and energy loss, really. If you've got rooms like this, the heating goes off within an hour, it feels cold in there typically. You've maybe got a similar experience. Some are better than that, but some are really, really awful. But did I see another hand somewhere? Sorry. Yeah. 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 So the question was, oh, sorry, the comment was that there are alternatives to rock wool. There are sheep wool, or so they're breathable. There's pros and cons to all of them. They don't lose, none of them lose their insulation properties over time, but some of them are lower carbon footprint just in terms of how they're made. Only if it's compressed. Oh, if it gets moist, then it's liable to sort of self-compress itself a little bit. But as long as it stays dry, rock wool's fine for many, many years. It doesn't deteriorate, and as long as it doesn't get squashed, because it's the air between the fibers that actually gives you insulation, not the rock wool itself, because rock wool itself is made of glass. So one more question. Yeah. Yeah. So there are two types of spray foam. There's closed cell, which is basically a type of foam that doesn't let any moisture through at all. And that's generally a really bad thing to do in buildings, because you want buildings to breathe. Doesn't mean you want water to get in there, but it allows water vapor to move around and keep things dry. And then there is open cell foams, which are breathable from a moisture point of view. And that's what you would do here. But even if you do this, you still maybe need to put more vent bricks in underneath to ensure there's adequate ventilation. So anyone who does a professional job of these sorts of things should be mindful of what they need to do to make sure that the subfloor space has still got enough ventilation, and that the rest of the house isn't going to get starved of ventilation as well. Yeah, there's always a ventilation angle, but not everyone is aware of it. Good question. Was that for me? No. And then similar to the situation, if you've got underfloor, suspended downstairs floor, it's almost as bad if you've got an integrated garage. Many people have got an integrated garage and they might have a bedroom that feels cold above it. The sorts of things you can do for this sort of situation here. There are a number of things you can do that will make a big difference to built-in garages. And there's a guide on the website specifically about what you can do built-in garages to make the rooms above feel much, much warmer as well. And then into well, that's how I start to look when I start to think about draft proofing. I think most people do. And the nag on your shoulder about drafts that need fixing, but they do matter, because if they're anywhere near your feet, it will affect how you feel and how much your energy bill is going to be, because you'll want the heating on more than you might need it to be. And I mentioned airflow and indoor air pollution, and it's really, really important that homes are well enough ventilated. We are continually, through doing things inside a home, building up pollutants in the air from cooking, chemicals that we use, viruses, pet dander, VOCs from furniture, log burners, if you've got one, create a lot of indoor pollution. And what else? I'm sure I've missed something. There are a very wide range of sources of indoor pollution all the time in a home. It's carbon dioxide being another one, which simply through breathing. And unless we allow or create enough ventilation opportunities, such as trickle vents, then issues of indoor air quality and humidity and mold and damp and condensation will build up and up and up. So there's a lot of people I see online who are sealing their house up and then wondering why they've got damp and mold issues. It's because there isn't enough ventilation for the home, and they are unknowingly building up indoor air pollution, which is extremely harmful. So that's all I'm going to say about ventilation, but there is a lot of information about ventilation on my website and how to understand that whole area of damp and condensation and mold as well. So yes, draft proofing and sealing up a home to get rid of certainly low level drafts is really important, but ventilation is incredibly important. And a lot of these things are very easy to fix. So UPVC windows and doors should last forever, and they should never be drafted. If you've got a drafted UPVC window or a door, it doesn't need replacing, it just needs fixing. Just needs adjustment, or it needs the right draft proofing product, or it needs the seal replacing. And this image on the right here is showing a UPVC door that's just got out of adjustment. And I'm aware of people who are replacing their windows because they're getting drafty, and UPVC lasts for hundreds of years. And the frames should never, ever be drafty. So they can all be fixed. And another little tip I learned from doing surveys was these things here, which you'll all be familiar what this is. This is a hinge for a modern, relatively modern anyway, UPVC window. And what nobody ever does with these things is oil the hinges. And I never did historically. And I started to find homes when I was doing surveys where the windows were getting drafted because the hinges were getting so tight that the window wasn't able to seal properly, wasn't able to move into its designed position. So they were getting a big draft at the hinge end. So all you need to do with these is give them a little blob of silicon-based WD-40 on all the hinge points, because they've got a very complicated job to do. And it will make the window last a lot longer, and it will solve the draft proofing issue, the draft issue that you might have. So it only takes 2 minutes to do on a window, and it makes a huge difference. And after doing surveys and finding these in other people's houses, I went home and I discovered some of my own were going that way as well. So I've now oiled mine. See, yeah, sure. So the question was, would I ever have sash windows? No, because they're incredibly hard to draft proof. Really hard. Yeah. And they're expensive anyway these days. Modern UPV sash windows are expensive to buy. Well, okay, so is wood better? Well, plastic does last forever. Well, certainly many, many decades. So if the question was about wood, that's slightly different, but it's still going to be more expensive, and it still generally will not be as good in terms of insulation. So overall, for the environment, it's better to look at it from a lifetime and an insulation point of view. Sash windows, you can get double glazed, but then you get into issues of weight and how heavy they are to lift and lower. Sash windows are only really continually used in a situation where there's a historical constraint on a house or a planning restriction that prevents you putting anything else in there. And I can sort of see why, because you look at an old Georgian house and it wouldn't look as nice as or traditional. But at the end of the day, we have to be pragmatic about solutions and accept that the world needs to move on, and we can't live in the historical world forever. We've got to accept some non-ideal solutions. And then another secret stealer of heat is if you've got an airing cupboard, or a cupboard that used to be an airing cupboard, go into it and look up, see what you might find. This is typically what I've seen loads and loads of places that have got homes that have got holes in ceilings from those sorts of cupboards straight into the loft. It's trickling away heat all year round because a plumber or an electrician has taken a cable out or a pipe out and not thought to seal it up. Here's another bad example. This is where there obviously are still existing pipes, but you can see the gaps going up into the loft from this particular pipework. It's been there many years, losing lots and lots of heat into the loft, but this is an area of heat loss that very rarely gets looked at. The next one is one of my neighbours. I was down there last winter it was, and I said, take me to your airing cupboard, and she took me to her airing cupboard. They've got a big hot water tank in there, they've got a gas boiler in there, and I looked up, and these were the holes immediately above the hot water tank into the attic. And despite the fact that it got a hot water tank in there and it got a boiler in there, the cupboard was not very warm at all. So all the heat had gone into the loft. And that hole on the right-hand side there, I could put my arm through that. And that had been like that a couple of winters. And she had no idea. They had no idea that they'd never gone into the cupboard and looked up like that. Really the enemy of the state in this particular domain is white van man. And if the back of the van or the dashboard looks like landfill, I would question that their attention to detail is not going to be terribly good. That's a real photograph. That's not something off the internet. So yeah, I must have the highest respect for some of the trades given what I see. And it's not just pipes going into lofts, it's anything that you've got going into your garage as well, in house cabling or pipe work, can often have a draft path through to that cold space. So yes, what so yeah. So the suggestion was suggesting what should you do? If you've got pipes and you've got holes like these, particularly the ones on the right, just get some squidgy sealant, you know, a frame sealant or something like fiber for a tube, and just blitz it in the tops there. If you've got cables, particularly if they're heavy cables for showers and things, you need to use an electrical version of that that's appropriate. It's called, I can't remember what it's called. There's one that's suitable for electrical items so that the cables won't overheat. If you've got a big hole, then you're into bits of plasterboard and blue Peter tactics, you know, with sticky back plastic and bits of paper, cardboard. So a little bit, the last leg now, a little bit of future gazing, and then we're going to have a quiz. So heat pumps, you may have heard about heat pumps. They've been quite in the news a lot recently, and obviously there was the announcement by Rishi and so on about that affected this area. But heat pumps are things that you've all got already in your homes. A fridge or a freezer is a heat pump, basically. We've had them for many years. We know them very well. They're very reliable. They last for decades. The first heat pump that I can find information on that was used in a house to heat a house that I found anyway online was in 1945 in Norwich. So to my knowledge, that's the first heat pump in a home in the world. So it's not a brand new technology, and it's certainly not a new technology for the UK, even though people are only starting to learn about it now. And there are two main types. The type that's going to be suitable for most homes is an air source heat pump where it harvests or it gathers its thermal energy from around the outside of a home, even in winter. It does work, and it upgrades that using effectively the reverse of an air conditioning system. It upgrades that to heat for homes. So air source heat pumps look typically like this, and that will be the most common solution and ideal for most homes. There are heat pumps called ground source heat pumps where you either get the heat from horizontal loops underneath the garden, although you do need a very big garden. So that will preclude it for most people, and it picks up heat from the earth around your house because it's continually heated by the sun throughout the year. If you can't do horizontal loops, the other way of doing it is with vertical boreholes, and I've got vertical boreholes. I've got a ground source heat pump, so I've got tubes that go down 100 meters basically underneath my driveway. Sounds very grand, doesn't it? It's only a driveway this big, but I've got 100 meters going down underneath it with a borehole. Sorry, question. Sorry, yes. Sure. The difference. Sure. So the difference in efficiency between an air and a ground source. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Right. Sure. The gap between the groundwater. Yeah. So ground source is a little bit more efficient. The gap is actually quite small. Air source now is about 400% efficient overall. It can be if it's designed right. They have got significantly better in the last decade or so. So the difference is actually quite small between these two, partly because our winters are much milder than they used to be, and they're getting milder. So air source only becomes inefficient when you go really very, very cold, like -5, -10. But anything 0 and upwards, they're actually very efficient. And yeah, so efficiency between 2.5 and 4.5 units of heat output from 1 unit of electricity. So I should say that the difference is so small that with hindsight now, I would probably have done an air source heat pump rather than a ground source heat pump. But when we did it, we wanted to do the best you could do. You know, we did it for those reasons, really. But they're very efficient in terms of using a little bit of electricity to get quite a lot of heat out of the air or out of the ground around a house. But they work in a way that means that the radiators don't get as hot, and for them to be efficient, you basically leave them on all the time. Doesn't mean the radiators are warm all the time, but they certainly will be most of the time. So you have a home that is always warm. That's one of the attractions of us going for a heat pump, was the house is always at a nice 20, 21, or whatever we want. We have our kitchen area, breakfast area at 23 typically. It's always in that temperature all year, certainly all through the winter. And obviously we turn it off in summer. But, so you leave it on constantly with radiators or underfloor heating at a temperature that keeps the house at a lovely even temperature all through winter. There's very little to service on them, but they are more expensive and they are very different to install compared to a gas boiler. So if you've got a gas boiler on the wall in your kitchen, well, that's going to go. If you have a heat pump, you have a box outside that generates your heat. So the geography of where things are is different. Question from the back. Yeah. Yes. So I've got TRVs or thermostats in each of the rooms. So I've got lounge at 20, bedrooms at 18, our kitchen breakfast area at 23. Yeah, the system just has one pipe to it and one pipe from it. So it's just looking at the overall house, and you can do the little bits of balancing within in terms of selection of what you want in each room yourself. So you've got complete control. So the geography of how they work is different. You don't have a box in your utility room in your kitchen. So one of the difficulties, one of the challenges in terms of cost and having them installed is the fact you've got something outside. So it's a bit of a lottery as to where that is in relation to the plumbing in the house. So I visited a cottage a little while ago where the gas boiler was on the wall in the kitchen, the other side of the window. And they were asking, would it be suitable for a heat pump? Well, that's ideal because you could put your heat pump just outside where the gas boiler is, and that makes it a very simple heat pump installation. And you may need to make some of the radiators bigger, and you may need to improve the insulation a little bit, but in fact, you can actually put a heat pump in any home pretty much with the right preparation and measures. Another question from the back. Hybrid. Sure. So the question was, can you have a hybrid system? Is what it's saying. You have gas and a heat pump. Some people do have a hybrid system where they choose to have a smaller heat pump and they retain the gas. It's a bit like a hybrid car or a plug-in hybrid vehicle. We thought about keeping our gas boiler because we weren't confident 13, 14 years ago. We decided not to, and we've never been caught. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. The question was in your particular case, you were looking at having a heat. So one of the challenges is the distance from the heat pump. Yeah. 10 meters from the heat pump. Yeah. Too far away. Yeah. Yes. So some heat pumps are starting to come out with a built-in hot water cylinder or a warm water cylinder or a but yeah, there are physical challenges sometimes. It is a little bit of a lottery. I'm not quite sure what other solutions are for that particular issue. But I had that issue. Mine's more than 10 meters away, so I had to I heat my water from solar instead, solar and immersion. Another question? Correct. You don't know. Yeah. Yeah. No, the government grant is only if you go completely green. Yeah. Another question from the back. Yeah. So the question was how is it compared to infrared? Well, infrared is using electricity to provide your heat, and it's roughly 4 times the cost for a unit of electricity compared to a unit of gas. But infrared is only really going to be cheaper if you're only heating the areas that you need where you are when you're there. Typically, a heat pump would heat the whole house evenly. Sure. Okay. So a heat pump will obviously be more expensive, and overall, it depends on how you use the house to a certain extent. If it's just one person, for example, you want to keep warm, the cheapest way to do that is just a portable infrared heat. Just warm the box. So it's very, very situational dependent. So, but in general, using any form of direct electric heating, whether it's fan heaters, oil filled, infrared heaters, is a lot more expensive, but it's very dependent on how the house is used. But in infrared, you get one unit of heat for 1 unit of electricity. With a heat pump, you'll get 3 to 4 typically. It certainly can be 4 units of heat for 1 unit of electricity, and the place is always. Yeah, another question. Sorry. So how efficient is the heat pump for an old-fashioned? The efficiency will be the same for all of them, any house, if it's designed in the right way. So you have to be quite precise when you're designing and specifying what heat pump goes into a house and how big the radiators are. If you design it right, and the design is done by the plumber or the heating engineer that's been trained in how to do it, if you design them correctly, you'll have the same efficiency. Yeah. So if you're using 100 kilowatt hours of gas typically to heat a home, it will still need 100 kilowatt hours of heat to heat it. But if you get your heat pump right, you'll only use 25 kilowatt hours of electricity to heat that home. So it's all down to how well the system has been designed. And unfortunately, there are cases of people are paying a lot of money to run the heat pump because the system wasn't designed properly or by somebody that's competent. And if you've got a big house like that, you'll still be using more energy than a small house. You double the size of the house, you double the exterior volume, exterior surfaces of the house, and you double the amount of energy used. But in terms of efficiency compared to gas, for example, it's irrelevant whether you've got a big house or a small house. And just the last bit on this slide is from the government announcement 3 or 4 weeks ago. Now the grant towards the heat pump is now 7,500. So if you are interested in a heat pump, the cost difference between going for a gas boiler instead of a heat pump is basically zero or nothing in it between the two. So you can get a heat pump for the same cost as a gas boiler, roughly. And then the last thing I just want to mention on this particular subject is one of the things that we never hear of in the UK, we're not used to at the moment, is heat networks. Where you have a central hot source of heat somewhere in the region. It might be waste heat from a data center, even schemes looking at getting heat from the underground in London. And there are some district heating networks in the UK, including a large one in Pimlico that's been around for many years. It's very common in Europe. Some countries in Europe have got sort of 30% or more of homes heated by district heating systems, where you just buy hot water. You've just got a meter that's monitoring how much warmth is coming into the home. And that is a very cheap way to heat a home. My experience and the numbers I've seen so far, but it's something we aren't used to, but it is something we are going to see a lot more of. And we need to have a lot more homes converting to district heating networks. And actually, it's easier to do for some types of home than it is to do heat pumps. So district heating is going to be something that will be an important role for in decarbonising the UK in the next 10, 20 years. So I hope you can become sort of Yeah, for a community heat pump. Great for you. So the question was, are there any incentives? Yeah, there is a government scheme called the Heat Network Development Fund, which is designed to help local authorities help people like yourself do a local heat pump system. I'm not very, I've lost touch with what the Heat Network Development Fund. It's, I don't know, a couple £100 million or it was of government money, but I'm a little bit out of touch with what it's actually funded. But the idea is to fund projects to demonstrate that it does work and it's cheap to do. But obviously it means everyone doing the same thing and wanting to do it in a particular area. So I hope you do become a bit of a nerd at the end of this and at least go home looking for drafts around your windows. If you're stuck for ideas for Christmas presents for people to get you, I highly recommend, like a niece or a nephew, ask them to get you one of these things, an infrared thermometer, which are typically, yeah, I'm running out of PC battery. Is that my battery? That's your battery at the back. Thank you, thank goodness. I'm not the one that's embarrassed. Good. Somebody rushing for a power supply there to keep this whole thing on. I'll talk quickly in case it crashes. So an infrared thermometer is a fantastic toy, really. Going around, you can go around your home, and I can tell you that ceiling up there is 21.2 degrees. The floor is 20. The table is going to be about the same, 20.8. But it's a great way of understanding which walls in a room are cooler or hotter. If you've got a loft conversion and you're wondering which are the cold surfaces, it's a great way of just getting calibrated with heat for the ridiculously small amount of about 12 quid, which is what they cost to run. That's all they are. It's a great thing to have as a way of getting nerdy on this particular subject. So I'm going to finish with a quiz. It's nothing to do with heating in the home, but it is to do with energy. Because there are some myths out there, and I'm determined to try and put some of them straight. And the first question is, I did press the button, so I shall wait. No. How's the laptop at the back doing? It's because I've got a low battery warning too now. Right. I have to go quickly. So if I want to heat water for a cup of tea, is it cheaper? Is it going to use less energy in a kettle or in a microwave? Same amount of water. I hear a lot of microwaves, a lot of kettles. Kettle, by a long way. People think microwaves are very efficient because they think all the energy goes into the food. A microwave actually uses a lot of energy just to generate the microwave. So if you put something in the microwave, even if it's just 20 seconds, and you take that food out, the cabinet, the inside of the microwave is all warm because it's the machine itself using a lot of energy to generate that microwave. So a microwave is only 40 to 50% efficient. So it's a very inefficient way of cooking. It's very convenient, but it's very inefficient, whereas a kettle is about 86% efficient. And I know that because I've measured it. Next one is a kettle compared to an instant hot water tap. Most of the time, the kettle is cheaper because an instant hot water tap sits there the whole time, keeping water hot for you behind the scenes. Sure. No, there's a whole article on my website which actually says if you drink more than 30 cups of tea a day, it will start to work out a little bit cheaper to use an instant. But even then, there are maintenance things you've got to do with a cooker or an instant hot water tap, and they're 800 quid to buy. So lovely for convenience, but from an energy, and the manufacturers of these things will give you the impression that it's energy efficient, but they're not. And they don't actually save water. If you boil around a reasonably right amount of water in the kettle, a kettle is better, unless you drink an awful lot of tea. Last slide now. I promise on this bit. If I want to do a small chicken, I want to roast it. Is it cheaper to do it in an electric oven or in an air fryer? Yes, it is actually true, because basically an air fryer is a small oven. and it just recirculates the air more rapidly. So in general terms, an air fryer is cheaper, something like a half the amount of energy. What about a gas oven to do a roast compared to an air fryer? If I want to cook a chicken is it cheaper to do it in a gas oven or to do it in an air fryer? Gas oven. Gas is much cheaper than electricity. You've got the indoor air pollution issue, which I want to keep on flagging because I want to flag that more than it deserves more flagging. Actually, gas will be cheaper. And then the last bit, if I've got the same stew, right, same recipe, and I want to cook it for the same amount of time at the same temperature in a slow cooker or an electric hob. It doesn't actually make much difference. It can be an induction hob or a conventional hob. The difference in efficiency is actually quite small. Slow cooker, everybody says slow cooker, you're wrong. And I know someone's actually done this experiment and it's on YouTube and I'm going to put it on my website. It does actually work out a bit cheaper to do it on an electric hob, even on a conventional, ordinary, squirrely heating hob. And you haven't, and the reason is because a slow cooker has got a bigger surface area. So it's losing more heat. It's a big item you're heating up a big box compared to a little thing. And I say, I've actually seen the results and it's, yeah. This is comparing the same meal cooked over the same amount of period with the same ingredients at the same temperature, because I've seen someone do it. Anyway, right. Moving on because of battery. Now I've got the wrong date on there. It should be December, shouldn't it? So I'm doing another talk. My apologies, people. So I'm doing a talk in December, 18th of December, on misinformation. It's about misinformation about climate change, really, and where it comes from and how to spot it. It's not trying to convince you this was wrong and this is what it should be. It's trying to help people understand how to spot misinformation, because it is really subtle and clever, and it isn't coming always from people you expect. So I'm doing a talk on that. I also do a talk, if you want it, on electric vehicles and demything that. I've been doing that talk for a few years now. I also do a talk about how the UK is really doing in addressing climate change, given the headlines about the UK as the best G7 country at reducing emissions. What's the truth, and what's the outlook, and also how to keep positive about climate change. There's a big part of that is my take on how to keep positive. And there's another talk I'm doing, will be doing in the new year, about how your home affects your health, which is a lot about air quality, but other things too. I haven't finished writing that talk yet, but that's something I'd love to do if you want me back. That's it. Thank you very much. Any more questions? Millions. Oh. So the question was, how do you know somebody about it? So there's an accreditation scheme and called the Microgeneration Certification Scheme. And you have to be on that if you want to do a government grant funded heat pump. So I would never go to anybody that isn't MCS accredited. Even some of those will be inexperienced. So if you do go for it, if you're interested in heat pumps, never touch anyone that hasn't got that. And even if you do, ask how many they've done, talk to previous customers and that sort of stuff. But that's a way of giving yourself a very strong assurance that you're getting the right thing. Or look for a partner in an organization called Heat Geeks, who are the best of the best. They're almost like an elite bunch of people around the UK that are all MCS accredited and will do a fantastic job. So yeah, there are people out there that will do it without accreditation, and you're really in the lap of the gods there, whether you get a good outcome or not. Another question. Oh.
Look at where would you start?
The question was, where would you start first with the bang for buck with any building? And obviously some buildings are really challenging. This is the sort of building that is really challenging. I mean, you may have heard the expression fabric first, which is focus on what you can do with draft proofing, insulation. Some of that can be quite challenging to work out how to do it for some properties in particular. If you've got a solid wall property in particular, if you can do it, do solid wall insulation, particularly exterior wall insulation. But yeah, you've got to start thinking about the long term and making a home future proof for decades. And the easiest way to make it overall the best thing to do is to get the building so that it's in a better place physically first, and then think about your heat source. Because if you can reduce the amount of energy your building needs, the amount of heat, the size of your heat pump will be smaller. It will be smaller to fit. It will cost you less to run, and over decades it will be the right thing to do. And the other thing is, although a heat pump is quite a disruptive thing to fit, it's no more disruptive than when homes first had their central heating system fitted. I put my own system in the 80s, floorboards everywhere, walls chiseled for pipe work. So it's much less disruptive than it was when we first started to introduce heating in homes. And also, once you've got a heat pump, if it needs replacing in 20 years' time, it's just take that white box away, put a new white box instead of it. So all the disruption is a one-off event. But yeah, you've got to focus on your fabric first, but not forgetting ventilation, of course, as well. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Sure. The question was, so you've got a old boiler. What sort of age home have you got? 1930s. Solid walls? You might have a cavity, actually. Okay. So the Committee on Climate Change assessment is that 60% of homes only need a very small amount of extra money on insulation and draft proofing, less than £1,000 for 60% of homes, to make them heat pump ready, to make them suitable for a heat pump. So generally quite low levels for most people. Obviously there'll be the other 40% which will need more than that, particularly if it's solid walls. So if you're in that category, then actually you may not need to do very much. I know people that have got 1960s, 1970s homes, and they've had to do very little, if anything. Top up the loft insulation. Certainly, you never need to insulate pipes under the floorboards. That's not something. I mean, if you're laying pipes for the first time, I probably would, but pipes that are existing, no, you wouldn't need to at all. So look, I would look at it with the glass half full, not empty. And unfortunately, some of the media, particularly Telegraph, has got a concerted campaign on rubbishing heat pumps with some crazy stuff that you couldn't make up. Yes, you need an EPC that's, or if you haven't already got one, you'd have to have an EPC that's at the right sort of level in terms of what its recommendations are to apply for the grant. Yeah, but the grant's around for 18 months, 2 years probably. Yeah. What about? Yeah. 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 You asked about conservation houses and areas that have got strict controls on them. I'm not sure what homes in those sorts of categories where they fall in relation to the government grant. I can't remember what the guidance or restrictions are for that. Yeah, so you can fit a heat pump in almost any house. So there's a trial that's been ongoing for 18 months where they've taken 750 homes with heat pumps of all ages, all home types, including your large six bedroom Victorians and so on. And they found that actually they didn't need to do very much to most of the homes. And the results of how those heat pumps have performed has been very good. So there is a myth out there that it only works for new builds or for super insulated homes. That's not the case. There are, again, perceptions that they are very noisy. So my daughter's got an air source heat pump, and it's near the front of the house. And she had a neighbour come across a few days after it had gone in to say, I'm worried about the noise. I'm going to have noise issues with your heat pump. And my daughter was stood talking to her, and she said, well, it's running now. And her neighbour said, oh gosh, is that it? And so she leant forward and she could hear a fan faintly in the background. And the neighbour said, no problem. So it's being overblown. The heat pump noises vary. Some brands are quieter than others, but actually, it's in the scheme of things, it's overplayed, massively overplayed. But there are some people that are very sensitive to it, but it is overplayed.
And we need to drive people to insulate. It's that, well, you can't have a heat pump without insulating properly. Therefore,
sure,
people will start to insulate properly.
So you're saying heat pumps are pushing people to insulate?
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. So there's two halves to that answer that question. One is if you want the government grant, you have to follow the reasonable steps that the assessment of the house require. So if it says you can't get the grant until you put a foot of loft insulation in, for example, so that is a bit of a stick to make you do it. But usually those sticks are quite weak. People don't actually need to do as much as they think they do. For everybody else, I've heard people say online, oh, heat pumps. I don't want to have a heat pump because I'll have to insulate my home. Why don't you do it anyway? I mean, the number of people updating their loft insulation in the owner-occupier home sector, which is like 60% of homes are owned by people who've got a mortgage on them, is tiny. People aren't motivated to improve the insulation on their homes. And I don't understand why. They've got a mental block with it as a society. Yeah. Yeah. But you've got the comfort issue with insulation. Your house will stay warmer longer. It will be cooler in summer. We've got a mental block on it. It has been, yeah. It has been. It has been, yeah. No. No, it's true. It's true. We've got a cognitive dissonance with it. It's weird. I mean, I've been into homes with doing energy surveys, and I said, "Oh, look, I can see a gap there between the patio door and the wall." Oh, yeah, we know about that. Well, why don't you plot the gap up? You've invited me to show you into your home to show you where you're losing heat, and you're telling me, "Oh, we've had that draft for years." Sure. So the direction of travel, if you want a really insulated home, you need to make it well insulated and you need to stop drafts. So the way it's going in terms of building regulations is to have a central ventilation system that takes stale heat out of rooms where pollution is generated, like bathrooms and kitchens. It takes the heat out of that air and it brings fresh air in and it warms that air so the heat is passed from the stale air to the fresh air. It's called mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. I've got it in my own house. I fitted it 13 years ago. And it means you get fantastic indoor air quality. It costs very little to run it. and sleep quality is better. It's just fabulous if you've ever been in a place with it. So a mechanically ventilated central system is something that will become much more common, and 1 in 3 new homes has got that now. So 1 in 3 new homes being built has got mechanical ventilation heat recovery, and there are other systems as well that will respond to humidity and extract only when there's humidity or air pollution. So yeah, mechanically managed systems to make a home professionally ventilated are going to come, and they're not that expensive, but they are really, really good for indoor lifestyle and comfort. Why shouldn't you? Yeah, trickle vents, keep them open. If you haven't got trickle vents, open the window, you know, on the security setting, 1 each end of the house. Just get a tiny amount of air moving through a house. There's a whole range of articles on my site about it in very plain English terms. Yes, it is really important, indoor air quality, really, really important. Online questions, yep. Do I know of any materials to insulate a wall cavity with less than 40 millimeters gap? I'm not an expert in cavity wall insulation. There is an organization called the Cavity Insulation Guarantee Agency. If you go onto their website, they will help answer that question. They are the gold standard in terms of professional guidance for people who are interested in loft insulation, and they only have a very high standard in terms of who can be one of their installers. It's a national scheme, so you can go onto that, and they'll give you that answer for free. So I don't know. The Cavity Insulation Guarantee Agency, I know it's amazing the things I know. Or SEGA, and it was set up to try and get away from cowboy operators that used to run riot many years ago. To try and get people assurances that cavity insulation is good if you have it professionally installed. What's the payback time for solar heating? Sure. So okay, there's 2 types of solar. Obviously, solar electricity panels, which we see a lot of, and then there are solar hot water panels, which I've got. Solar hot water is really useful, but it's quite expensive to do as a retrofit, and your payback is quite long. So the payback on this is long, solar hot water. So whereas electricity is much quicker payback. I don't know what it is. It depends on how much energy you use as well yourself, and whether you've got batteries and so on. And solar thermal is great if you want to do the right thing long term for your house, and it suits the house to have it on the roof as well and all that sort of stuff. But it's fantastic if you've got it, because you get a real feel good factor, because 6 or 7 months of the year, all your hot water is off the roof.
Then solar heating.
No. The other thing about solar heating is you can't realistically heat your home from solar panels in winter, because there isn't enough energy falling on the roof of a house unless you use very little energy. So you can't realistically do that, but you can heat water off solar electricity as well as obviously solar hot water panels.
Any other questions?
Good.